Talking about your trauma makes it worse. I remember when the magnitude of my trauma hit me. It was about 10, 11 months after my daughter Maya died in her sleep. And I was talking about the day in which she died. And as I was giving the details of finding her, trying to do CPR while calling 911, I went into what we call a flashback. I was reliving every second, every thought, every feeling, every action. I was back in that horrific moment. 6 months to a year after that, I had series of kind of flashbacks and dissociative events, and really began to learn, how do you identify and release trauma? So what did I figure out from living it? I figured out that we must separate our grief from our trauma. We must separate things like negative self-talk, injustices, anxiety, behaviors, and choices. We've got to pull all of those things apart. I call it think, organize, choose. And it's the umbrella of what we do in the Mentally Strong method. What do I mean by think? We all know that we need to think through our problems. We all do think. Some of us more efficiently than others. Maybe you identify as an overthinker. And maybe you're constantly thinking about your problems. Well, there is an actual medical term for that, and it's called rumination. When we overthink something, any kind of problem, any kind of thought, and it's in a negative capacity, we call that rumination. So what happens when you ruminate on a thought? When you ruminate on a thought, it creates a neural pathway in your brain. And the more you think about it, the more you talk about it, the stronger that neural pathway becomes. So hopefully your therapist is sharing this with you, that these negative neural pathways need to be broken, and talk therapy is not the answer. When you just continue to talk about your trauma, you are actually solidifying or strengthening that negative neural pathway in your brain. So how do you learn to think efficiently? Well, I do this thing called the Mentally Strong method, and we map out patterns. And we start with thoughts or feelings and what makes you feel like this now, what's made you feel like this in the past, your childhood, and your relationship with God. Why is that important? Because you're like, I have a problem right now. I'm, in my past trauma is impacting how I show up today. Or maybe you're in trauma right now. And honestly, if you are in trauma right now, it is hard to release the trauma because your body is naturally in this fight or flight for survival for you. And I talk about this a lot with special needs parents. So I've lost 3 children over the course of 20 years, 2 to a rare neurodegenerative condition. And with my son Reggie, I was in this 10 years of medical trauma, like always afraid that he was going to die. And every hospitalization, every ICU visit, every seizure was trauma. And if you are in the midst of that, it is hard to begin releasing it. You can, but you also have to stay in the moment and protect your child, right? If you are in a traumatic relationship, that's different. That, we're going to talk about behaviors and choices. You can choose to separate from that relationship. So that's what efficient thinking is, right? It's mapping out patterns And when you do that, when you map out patterns, you begin to have what I call aha moments. So you may not know all of the things that are impacting you. I remember it was about 2 months after my daughter Maya died. I was still in shock. And I chose to go through the Mentally Strong method in front of my whole staff at Mentally Strong. And we got to the trauma section, and I was like, I don't have any trauma. I was still in denial, and that's okay. It wasn't until, like I said, 11 months later. So learning to think through your problems, right? Like making it efficient so that you can have those aha moments. For me, that aha moment was realizing the trauma. And you can actually witness it in my documentary. So a couple months after Maya died, I decided to go through like a grief journey and film the whole thing. I knew I wanted to create a documentary, but I didn't know to what extent. But I filmed all of this, and you can actually see in the documentary me like this unraveling of the trauma. And it started with anger. I'm angry. I'm so angry, and I'm trying to deal with the anger in a healthy way. I've got like a punching bag up, and I'm punching it, and I'm writing what I'm angry about on this punching bag, and I'm just punching and punching and punching. And you see it play out in the documentary where I realize that this is trauma, and trauma hurts differently. And so there I was with grief and trauma all enmeshed together. And even though I knew the Mentally Strong method, you can see it like unraveling. It took some time to unravel that and really be able to clearly distinguish what is trauma and what is grief. So to learn the Mentally Strong method, you need to go through like a whole course or come and spend some time with me. But if you click the link below, you can get a worksheet that kind of summarizes Think, Organize, Choose. I want you to download that worksheet. I want you to learn Think, Organize, and Choose can be like the starting point for every problem that you have in your life. Can you think through it? Can you organize? And can you make choices? My name is Dr. B. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And as you've heard, I've also been through pretty traumatic things. I lost my father when I was 10 months old, raised by my mother, who was constantly trying to work out her own things, so a little bit of absenteeism there. And then I get married, have 2 children, adopt 5. One dies in a drowning accident. Then Reggie begins to have catastrophic epilepsy, 10 years of medical trauma, and Reggie dies in 2016. And then Maya dies in her sleep, and then my husband dies. So I know grief and trauma intimately. So what do I mean when I say think, organize, choose? So hopefully you've downloaded the worksheet and you can see, what are your problems? List those problems. Now let's organize them. We talk about these different categories and we go into depth in the Mentally Strong method, but they're listed there on the worksheet. We have core connections. Core connections are these buttons, these internal buttons that go all the way back to your childhood. For me, my biggest button is I'm not good enough. And in this case, I'm not good enough to save my children. The most important job you will ever have is to raise your children. And I felt like a failure. I lost. That's different than grief. Grief is the pain of actually losing someone. The idea that I thought I could save them and that I wasn't good enough, that's not grief. So when you look at these 10 categories, grief and trauma, I obviously experienced both grief and trauma. Grief is not just this horrible trauma, right? Like grief is you lost your grandmother at an appropriate time, right? That's still grief. You're still grieving the loss of that person. Or maybe you lost your best friend in a drunk driving accident. That's both grief and trauma. Maybe you think you could have stopped it. That's grief, trauma, negative thoughts. And maybe some behaviors and choices, right? Do you see how when you're thinking through something, we often think about it in a negative enmeshment, and that causes those negative neural pathways. But we're going to learn to organize those. The negative thought, the negative dialogue that you have going on in your head, I get it. I have told myself I'm a bad mother. I've told myself I'm a bad nurse. I should have seen the signs of death. I should have been able to save my children. But that's not grief. That is not grief. That is the trauma enmeshed with the grief that's producing a negative thought that actually goes back to my childhood of my core connections of not feeling good enough, right? We want to pretend, or we want to believe that we have, worked through all of our childhood issues. And if you have been on that journey, yes, you have. But you will have more problems in your life. And what are you going to do with that? You are going to think, organize, and choose. So what do we do with the choosing? I hope at this point you're beginning to feel empowered. You have the list of things to organize. You have this idea that you can have efficient thinking and you can organize those things. Now, what do you choose? We all know that we should be choosing positive thoughts, positive behaviors, and that's great. That's 2 of the 10 categories. But what are we choosing to do about our grief? Again, you probably have grief. Divorce is grief. An argument with a loved one that severs or changes your relationship is grief. We all experience grief. Grief is a part of our story, right? But if that grief continues to have a negative impact on us, then we're not processing the grief properly, and there's other categories that need to be dealt with. So I have these 10 categories because there's something distinctly different to do in each of the categories. So we talked about a negative thought. We need to replace those things with positive thought. Behaviors and choices, we need to be disciplined and have those behaviors and choices. Anxiety. If you have experienced trauma, I can almost guarantee you have anxiety going on. What do we do with that anxiety? The anxiety itself is not the trauma. The anxiety is your body's physical response to the trauma. And so we need to learn how to control or manage our anxiety. Injustices are different. It's not fair that I've lost 3 children and my husband. You may think of that as an injustice. For me, it goes into spiritual conflict because I believe that there's a loving God that loves me and protects me, and he didn't protect my children, and I did not feel him answering my prayers in the midst of this trauma, and I had to go through pretty significant wrestling with God to work out this spiritual conflict. So as you look at those 10 categories, I want you to jot down, and you can be on a separate piece of paper, as far as what's going on right now, what categories do they fit into? And it could go into different categories. So like losing my daughter Maya is obviously grief. But remember, I told you this big story about how my negative thoughts actually are pushing that core connection button. So the core connection of not feeling like I'm enough, the negative thoughts of not being a good mother, not being a good nurse, behaviors and choices. I really beat myself up about not taking my son to the emergency room earlier or not sleeping with my daughter the night that she died. And those are behaviors and choices that may have made a difference in the outcome. Working through my spiritual conflict, I don't think it was going to make a difference in the outcome. But from a worldly standpoint, I could have made a better decision, right? We have to own that. I've worked with people who have been the drunk driver in the accident where they were injured or in the accident where they hurt someone else. That is a behavior and choice that you have to own. And if the behavior and choice is something like that, you also have to learn to forgive yourself, right? We can produce our own trauma. Sometimes we are doing things in our life to re-traumatize ourselves over and over again because we think it's our fault, right? So behaviors and choices is different than the negative thought. It's different than the trauma, right? You got to own that. So that's what I mean when I say, here's these 10 categories, and you have to do something different for all of those. Now, to talk about trauma specifically, if you are experiencing trauma, you want to go to a therapist and work through your trauma, I want you to go in with the intent of the trauma therapist helping you release trauma. Because if you just go in and do the talk therapy, it's not going to work. It actually can make it worse. So what did I do for my trauma? You can see this in the documentary as well. I did some brain spotting, which is a thing that you can go to a licensed therapist to get done. I did some TMS. I have done a lot of spiritual work with meditations and sound bowls and Reiki and acupuncture. I have just really consciously, and I think this is the biggest thing, when you use the mentally strong method, the think, organize, and choose, you are able to know your intent. You have the knowledge of these organizational categories that need something different. And you have the intent of separating them, right? I download the worksheet. It's really just the entry point of understanding what it means to think, organize, and choose. Look into some of my other programs. You can learn the Mentally Strong Method in an online course, or you can come and spend 3 intense days with me in my home in beautiful Colorado Springs, and we can dive deep into these 10 categories and leave with a clear plan of how do we actually choose the life that we want. I mentioned a little bit about anger. Anger is always a secondary emotion. If you are experiencing anger, please continue watching, understanding and managing anger, understanding that there's all this stuff underneath that anger. I too believe that you are mentally strong.